Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a privilege to welcome you to the last event of the 2017-18 series of the MIT Enterprise Forum of the Northwest. We've covered a lot of ground this year. We mastered blockchain. That was easy. IoT was knocked out. We're done with that. What else? Now we're going to learn how to take over the world, as it were, with our friends, the machines. So if anyone has any questions about how to take over the world, you're in the right place. So tonight we're hoping to be a little bit more interactive, and we're hoping to actually enjoy ourselves for once. So what I'm asking you to do is there's a Wi-Fi guest network, and I would like you to sign into it. The password is SeattleU. The username is G-Town4. And we're going to be asking some polling questions. And some of you are going to get them right, and some of you are not, and that's okay. We're probably going to take your name badges away if you don't get them right, but that's okay. We'll deal with that later. Without further ado, I want to introduce the man with the plan, Mr. Bob. Bob.
Thanks, Ben. I want to start with a very simple idea, that it's a beautiful sunny day out there, and all of you have chosen to come in here. So I'd like to ask the people from Town Hall, the people from MIT, the people from Seattle University, and the panel to give our audience a big round of applause, because they're here. Thank you very much. I also was thinking that there's a level of bias here, that I'm the MC and the subject is human-machine interface, so I brought Alexa here as my co-MC. So we're going to figure out how to deal with that later. Okay, 3 quick points, and then I'm going to introduce the panel. I think one of the key issues here of machine-human interface involves trust. And to address that, I have 3 quick points. One is a Stephen Hawking quote. We only have to look at ourselves to see how intelligent life might develop into something we wouldn't want to meet. A study estimated that 60% of big data projects fail to become operationalized. And Facebook. I think all of these give an example that all tech is not good, that there's risks involved with technology. So we're all really lucky, not that I'm here, but that we have 3 incredible experts to give a whole lot of new insight on this particular topic. So with that, I'd like to dive in and introduce Trond Nielsen. Wave to the crowd so they know who you are, Trond. Trond is the Director of Development and Virtual Therapeutics working on healthcare applications of VR/AR, founder of the Seattle Immersive Technology Association. And I'm asking each of the panelists to do a minute or 2 overview just to orient you to the topic and where they're coming from. So take it away, Trond.
Sure. So my work and my past work has in large part been oriented around implementation of virtual and augmented reality type applications in a variety of fields. I've been in that space for about 15 years. But really the topics that I'm more interested in talking about are around how technology changes us. So I'm talking here both in the sense of how it changes us by the fact that we have this ability to ourselves now, so I can pull out my phone and I can have access to a service that I wouldn't have otherwise. But I'm also interested in how technology will change us both in terms of how we think of ethics and society in the long term. So I tend to be interested in that sort of the long distance thinking. So I'm very interested in questions of ethics. I did a bunch of work with the Value Sensitive Design group at UW, which helped inform me. Their approach is very much about identifying the philosophical values, the social values that you want to embody in a system when you're designing it, and then being clear about those before you even start designing. So those are the sorts of questions I'm mostly interested in. But fundamentally, I'm a tech head, I'm an engineer, that's what I do day to day, but these are all the questions that occupy me in the evenings.
And I remember a conversation where you said you had a bit of a bleak outlook. Would you like to address that for just a second?
Sure. Actually, I've gone through a changed in my perspective on things. Back in, say, 10 years ago, I was a pretty optimistic techno-utopian transhumanist. Not at the extreme level that you get on some of them, but I'm still pretty optimistic about the ability of technology to solve problems. What I have become a lot less optimistic about is our ability as societies to deal with the disparities of power that come from those. And I also, more recently, I just finished reading a book called Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom, and he's a philosopher at the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford, very interested in the implications of having incredibly intelligent general intelligence. So we're not talking about like artificial intelligence that's really good at solving one problem, but that's good at solving a wide variety of problems. You can ask it a general question and it will tell you the optimal strategy to, say, eliminate the Iranian Islamic regime. I don't know that I like the fact that if we have systems like that, whoever has access to them will be able to make optimal decisions that allow them to have extreme levels of power over society as a whole. And I just don't know how we put in the right sorts of institutions and deal with this sort of thing.
On Tron's left is Miles Coleman. Miles is the Director of Digital Technology and Culture Program at Seattle University. Could I hear at least one person react from Seattle University? There we go. Yeah, okay. He's your home guy. You got to applaud for this.
All three of us.
He is Digital Technology and Cultures Program, where he teaches and studies digital rhetoric, opportunities, and persuasion in bots. Miles.
Hello. So my background is in rhetoric. I read a lot of Aristotle. I also really like computers. And it turns out that you can do those two things in digital rhetoric. So I study how bots, machines, and automation present new emerging kinds of arguments. And increasingly, we're able to appropriate the movements of machines in order to make new arguments. So where traditionally we might suspect that a politician is making an argument because they're giving us a speech and using a rhetorical flourish, increasingly machines are the rhetorical flourishes that we can use to construct certain user experiences that can forward new experiences and perspectives about the world, which can be opportunities of persuasion or ethical threats of persuasion. So for instance, when vaccine denialists make their own interface so that you can calculate the dangerous ingredients of vaccines, they're appropriating a tradition of interface design in order to construct an argument about science.
As a Renaissance man, talk about art, science, and politics from a humanistic perspective. This is technology, dude. It's ones and zeros.
Well, when we talk about politics, science, I usually break it out art, science, and politics as the ends of persuasion. And so when we're thinking about robots, they bring a new aura. It is a new art. When we think about robots, when we're making political parody, for instance, Deep Drumpf, which is a Twitter bot, trained on transcripts of Donald Trump, and it says Donald Trump things. Which is a new kind of way to give a political parody that carries a specific kind of aura with it because it's been run through a machine learning system in order to learn how to talk like Donald Trump. So you get this direct witness into Trumpery.
He did say Trumpery, didn't he? Our third panelist is Kat Holmes, Fast Company's most creative people in business selection for the year 2017. Oh, I'm going to make you the only one. She's founder of Kata, a design firm with a mission of advancing inclusive product development. She's focused on hands-on development, and she led Microsoft's executive program for inclusive product innovation and created a radical new toolkit for designing, thinking, and practicing. And before I let her talk, her mom's in the audience. Could you give Kat's mom a round of applause? Turn around. Kat just trumped all of us by bringing her mother close to Mother's Day. We didn't see that one coming. Kat.
Thank you. Welcome. Thanks for being here tonight. There's a lot of words in that. Inclusion was used multiple times. I really have taken a deep dive into that. My background is in human-computer interaction. I studied orthopedic biomechanics and material science engineering in college, and somehow that turned into working in the software realm. The starting point towards inclusion for me was really working on Cortana in 2013, so Microsoft's personal digital assistant. And in that process, realized how little we as people who make products understood about human beings, and in particular, human diversity. And what I mean by that is the diversity of abilities, but also the diversity of ways that we interact with each other and with technology, and the ways that we now all interact with digital touch points in dozens of places in our day just has led to this huge gap in knowledge in a lot of companies on how to practice that well. So when I talk about product development, my thesis, I'd say, is that working on product design and product development by including communities who have been excluded for a very long time from participation in the design process, certainly, but also participation in using these products, bringing people into that process is a way to innovate and also a way to a more inclusive society. And sometimes it's faster to change technology than it is to change people. So I also find it's an interesting conversation to be having. So I left Microsoft a year ago. I quit my job, which was super liberating, and then freaked out because I started a company. And a week after that was invited to write a book on the topic as well. And so this year's been a wild ride of working with a wide range of startups and large companies, Spotify, Pinterest, Uber's an interesting one. They got some inclusion-related stuff happening, and Facebook. So working with companies, and really the work has been first having a conversation about what human diversity looks like as we're designing products and how we account for that. So that's an interaction conversation.
This is only a quasi-sarcastic question, but I thought the whole point of technology was exclusion.
The whole point, say more, what do you mean by that?
Well, just how all of the geeks we knew kind of had their own language, had their own approach, the computers. Talk just for a moment about inclusion, the importance
that's a really great question. Yeah, there's two things in that. I think one is that exclusion is inherent to good constraints. Like when you're designing, you're making good product, having a good constraint or a good focus, or good customer focus is important. So there's an importance in nuance and specialty of an audience or of a product. The problem is when we create products that people can't use even if they want to participate. Or when we create a solution that people can't access even if they want to engage in the communication or the creativity, where we create these experiences that gate that based on ability or based on preference. And so exclusion, it's not inherently good or bad, it's just that when we are intentionally acknowledging that we've created an exclusive environment versus accidentally, as a byproduct, created an environment that people can't participate in, that's the important nuance. So my focus is on how we can be intentional and take responsibility for that.
Thank you. Okay, we're now an interesting panel because we care about what you think about. So what we are going to do is use some software so we can ask you some poll questions during the event so we can learn a little bit more about what you think, and that can help us direct where the program's going. So Ben, you want to help me explain to them what they need to do?
I'm just typing in. I heard some chatter when I... Username, password.
Okay, so Seattle U is the password, and G-Town is... Everybody got that? Are you all signed in to Wi-Fi?
Oh, it's G-Town 4.
It should be Seattle.
This is the guest. And for whatever reason, Seattle U doesn't want us using this, so shh.
Yeah, don't tell anyone. Turn off the video cameras. Okay, now you want to go to Poll Everywhere?
Yes?
Is everyone online? Okay, let's get critical mass here.
How do we get a new audience?
No, we love this audience, don't we?
Sorry.
Okay, can we move on? Are you online? No. Okay.
That's because there's 150 of you trying to do it at the same time.
Okay, okay, there we go. Okay, so now what we want to do is you have to text. Okay, the phone number, as it were, the text number is 22333. And then 2, so that's what you do instead of the phone number. And then MIT Enterprise 941, MIT-ENTERPRIS 941 is the message. You with me? And then you'll get a message back. Are we making progress?
I feel like there's a design issue here that we should be discussing, but I'm not quite sure exactly how to put it politely.
Actually,
I would say that we had an
we don't want to do any poll
algorithmic
questions. This is just to show you how sloppy machine-human interaction can be. Okay, there they go. They're starting to pop up.
Good.
So keep going. The phone number is 22333, MIT Enterprise. You'll get a message. Then you type in 1 or 2 words, and this will help us see what scares you the most about technology.
So humans scare people. Who else is afraid of humans? Go ahead. It's okay. You can tell me. Yeah.
Okay, thank you all for surviving that experience.
Do we get to keep this work?
Thriving,
when it's done?
Bob.
I want to make a shirt out of it.
Yeah, I feel like this is a piece of research right here.
Hey, look at that. It's really
Skynet
working.
spiders.
And there's a dolphin. Who put in the dolphin?
Wow.
It's like a cyborg.
This would be really interesting.
You know, if dolphins became the machines, that would be scary.
I hope someone doesn't put one of those soda containers in it because we have a dolphin. That's a bad joke. There you go. Okay, Tron. In The Matrix, Agent Smith said, when we started thinking for you, it became our civilization. Talk to me about that blurry line when we start to empower technology and it begins to control us.
So that's a really interesting one. I have to say, when you said the way you said that first, but I really felt like I was on a game show for a second. But the idea of computers thinking for us, I think there's a really interesting little distinction in there that helps unravel that a lot, and that's the distinction between a computer doing the work of thinking for you and a computer analyzing and making decisions on your behalf. So what we have right now with most artificial intelligence systems, the sorts of things we talk about with machine learning, is we're using training to train a computer to do a thinking task for us automatically. There's not a lot of places where the computer is making decisions on our behalf. There's a caveat to that, though, which is that, of course, if a computer's doing the thinking tasks for you, and then you are just taking the results of that thinking task and then quickly, arbitrarily choosing between the two of you, well, then you're making a decision. But what you're doing there is you are abdicating your responsibility to understand the implications of the decision you're making. So if you imagine, for example, just to pick something political, because we've already gone there, someone who is taking an analysis of a social network, say some of the Cambridge Analytica stuff, they're taking this, they are making a quick decision based on some data that they've got there. So the data says that, if I say these sorts of things, these people will vote for me. Well, the computer's done the work, right? It's analyzed this sort of material from somewhere. It's done a lot of the thinking work, but the decision is still in the hands of the human. And I'm trying to think about this while I'm talking. I cannot think of a good example where the computer is yet in a place where the computer is clearly making the decision, and it's not simply the case that the person is making the decision, but is in the process is abdicating their responsibility to do that properly by not really thinking about that decision, but assuming the computer's done it for them. So I think we're not yet at that point, but I do really worry about that point because I don't trust myself to make decisions, let alone other people, let alone computers. So I don't have a good answer for what, how are we going to get through that place? How are we going to get to a point? It's arguable actually that once we get past these scope of the sorts of decisions that computers are making are based on rote thinking tasks and bad biases that we put into it. I get the impression that decisions made by an algorithmic thing that are explicitly designed to listen to us all as much as possible and then give us an answer, they're going to be a lot freer of the biases and things that we make. So while on the one hand I'm kind of a little bit scared of how that gets there, I feel like actually that will be a good thing. And I don't quite buy the idea that then that would be the machine's civilization at that point. I think the machine is still, in a way, doing a piece of work for us. It is taking all of the thoughts that we have, all of the wants that we have, and making the decision for us. So if you imagine, I was talking about Nick Bostrom, he talks about the idea of a sovereign superintelligence. So this is a superintelligence that makes decisions on our behalf. It weighs all the factors. It is, if you read that book, you'll know that he spends about half the book on how exactly do you specify morality in a way that a computer can understand. But assuming that you can do that, and he has some ideas on how you can, it's doing the work of pulling all those things together and then making the best possible decision based on that. And so in that case, all of the input is from humans, but the decision is made by the computer based on algorithms and based on ethics that the humans are given. So I don't really feel like, even in that place, it's the machine civilization.
Either of you want to dive in on this?
Yeah, I'd love to. And then we can battle it out. So what's interesting, so I love the way of thinking about it in terms of decision making, and even just seeing the Google Duplex demo at I/O and the little demo of an assistant. This is where I think digital assistants and machine learning driving some of those decisions is going to really test that sooner than it's testing it already, I believe. But in that demo, for folks who haven't seen it, it's an assistant making a call to a human being at a salon to make a hair appointment for a client, the assistant's client, another human being. And in that process, given choices about what time and which kind of service, and making choices in that, again, probably knowing what is available, but there's those little choices that are happening. And seeing that happen so quickly, I think was a real shock for some people. And then knowing also the amount of machine learning driven recommendations that are being applied to social systems. Something like, are you qualified for this home loan? Or what's the recommended criminal justice sentence for someone with this background and this, series of events that happened? That these are being built in a way that are recommending decision-making that almost removes some element of that calculus that a human being would do, but then presenting it as if it is a unbiased system. And
so it's not that the computer's making the decision so much as it's influencing the decision. And that's a point I didn't touch on at all, but that's probably where the computer or the machines, so to speak, or the people controlling the machines will be controlling our civilization or our minds as much. But it's the setting of defaults.
That's a good distinction. And then the element of bias as well, and the choices of the data that's used to train those systems, having inherent, we do things in aggregate, large amounts of data, and we tend to take an averaging approach to that. What's the normal of this data? But then applying that to an individual circumstance is one of those I think that's one of the great tensions that we're going to have to contend with going forward in terms of how those systems are being applied towards individual lives.
So I have a less scary take. The first thing I'll say is the duplex thing blew my mind. The way that this bot is able to say, okay, all right, and then deal with the other person's pauses and kind of like off cadence rhythm. And at one point, the interlocutor misses what time the scheduled appointment was supposed to be, and then the bot repeats, no, May the 7th, and it's mind blowing to see. But in the idea that I want to kind of complicate the idea that there is bias in these systems, but it's super complicated because there's so many hands in the pot. And so when we're, Duplex is like a whole bunch of different machine learning libraries that Google's been working on over a long time, as well as a number of different teams all working tangentially and then coming together later. So there's all of these individuals with all of these different kinds of agency and different will and intent being inscribed into their code in different ways. And it's in that moment, in between us and the machine, where we can't actually perceive that somebody else sat down and wrote the code that is perceiving what we said and is now outputting from the bot, that we find magic. And I think that there is this really magical experience that sometimes comes from bots. I've been volunteering at a nonprofit here in town, and they deal with kids with cancer. And so we were messing around with some machine learning libraries, and we found some transcripts from some interviews with parents talking about their kids having cancer. And just because I had them laying around, I put them into the bot. And then I started chatting with the bot, and I had this really deep experience talking with somebody talking about their kid having cancer. And it's because I feel like I was actually interacting with a model of that person because I don't know the libraries that we're programming in the background. I really don't know. I'm not a programmer. I just know that this person was speaking to me, and there was this kind of like capture of the movement instilled in the machine that I was interacting with.
That point about what the bot consumes, like you're made of you are what you eat. So a machine learning system is made of what it consumes to be trained by. And so some of you may be aware, there's a Tay, the name of the bot that Microsoft put up on Twitter at one point. So it was a chat bot. They put it on Twitter to experiment with, could a bot behave like a person on Twitter? And so it listened to all the sorts of things that people said on Twitter. And very shortly, Microsoft took it down because it was quite vulgar.
I will say that Xiaoice has been running in China for
and
5 years.
it was an experiment. They learned a lot from it. It's not to say that it's inherently necessarily that way, but the point is how you train the system is incredibly important, and that's where these biases come from. And it's also probably worth flagging that when we talk about this sort of bias going into systems, often it's virtually never intentional. I mean, I'm sure certain intentional bias of that sort exists out there, but so much of the time it's just based on what's available. If you've got a corpus of interviews with people, cancer patients in America, you're going to get something that's predominantly representative of America. You're probably not going to get an African sensitivity based on that, simply because that's the data that's available.
I want to ask look at this. Anybody see anything interesting they want to comment here on things that are scaring those people about technology?
I think it's fascinating the role that movies have in influencing our feelings about the future. I mean, you asked a question about The Matrix. I was going to talk about Her at some point, Skynet. I think it's fascinating how that shapes what we make as well. That, inside of many large companies, there are conversations about how can we create that Minority Report experience, or how can we create that immersive, Ready Player One experience. And it's one of these great touchstone, great meaning large, huge touchstones that we have as people who make solutions to think about what to make next. And it's kind of a scary cycle to think about.
And do you think that's in reference to James Cameron's Terminator that is scaring people? Like nobody wants to see a Terminator 4, like Terminator 2 was
I would put
enough?
money on it, but maybe there's
Okay.
another, maybe it's the electrical component. People are really...
Okay.
Anything interesting for you guys up there?
The term loathing, I think it's interesting in thinking about, do we derive loathing from machines? Or is it, I'm waiting for somebody to pop out and be like, no, I meant...
It's a
It's the same guy that wrote in The Dolphin, so sorry.
There's not a lot of words in there that I'm like, this represents a clear threat to me. There's some, obviously Skynet / Terminator, those sorts of things. Obviously they are, movie villains. They are clear threat things. But there's, I guess spiders are a threat. But a lot of these are modifying words or words about the way things are using. And I'm not clear what, for example, downstream means. I wasn't able to pick that out. But presentation, technologies, loss, brain, good. There's a lot of words here that don't directly represent a clear threat. I mean, I'm really curious about the meaning of those. And it's interesting the variety too. It's not like everyone's scared of robots. Well, I guess they are, because Skynet right is in the middle. But I'm kind of discarding that a little bit because it is a movie reference.
Okay, we can move on. Miles, Gary Kasparov said, "I don't know how we can exist knowing that there exists something mentally stronger than us." What do you talked about robot Jesus and machines arguing. Give us a sense of the future with these machines getting more power.
So I'll say two things, and kind of working off Kat's comment about fiction for the second part. But the first thing, I don't think robots are scary because they're really smart. I think they're scary because they're really dumb. So in the sense that we are increasingly seeing things like X.AI, which is a little chatbot that scans your calendar and then can schedule appointments for you in the background. You basically just say, hey, and then you name your assistant and it schedules for you. It's amazing to not have to schedule your own appointments. But as we increasingly hand over our private information to people, I just imagine hey, hey Alexa or Cortana or Siri or Choose Your Assistant, can you tweet something out for me? Just something random. Just go through my email. And then a rumor email that you had posted, the bot's like, did I do the good? And no, because they're dumb. And I don't think that they're gonna like end humanity. I think that they're gonna end our individual lives in little small idiot accidents because bots are really dumb. And to the second point, bots are what we make them. And largely, most people, they're only referent of AI, generally speaking. I mean, increasingly more and more people are understanding how AI actually works. But most people's only referent is Terminator, or Bicentennial Man, or The Matrix, or these kind of like scary, dystopian, or really sad kinds of takes on AI. And so we don't really see it in the wild all that much. And Kasparov is really interesting. I remember when I was 11 years old, I bought a DVD off of a homeless person playing chess in the park in San Francisco. And it was about Kasparov losing to IBM's Deep Blue. I think that his response, and sticking with we make bots what we want them to be. In that particular instance, it had to have been stronger. It wasn't just that they had figured out the algorithm of chess. It was that it outthought him, because that's what his game was. And so it's kind of interesting to think about some of the mental gymnastics that we do and the reference that we pull, and sometimes that can distract us maybe from the reality of AI, which is that it's really dumb.
Do either of you want to dive in on this?
I really do. I was just listening to you talking there, and maybe of Gary Kasparov, there's no one smarter than him in the room or in the world, but throughout almost all of human history, most people, the vast majority of people, have been very comfortable with the idea that there are things out there that are smarter than them, simply through religion. Right? People have always been comfortable with the idea that there are spirits, gods, whatever, that know more than them, that control their lives in some way. So in that sense, I don't think it's such a scary concept. And my concern actually about, as we get technology that becomes smarter than us, that is a real measurable thing that I can turn it off, I can turn it on, I can change it, I can code it, I can fiddle with it. Religion is an underpinning of so many people's lives. It forms a moral basis for how they make their decisions. It guides politics, it guides so many things. What happens when we start having a box over there that's smarter than your God? Seriously, I really don't know what this is going to do to the way that we think about the other, about the world, about the end times, all of these sorts of things that are sort of deep currents within society. I just don't know how that's going to work, and I invite some sci-fi authors to get into that.
Sounds like a good movie. Yeah, the different kinds, like what is intelligence as well? I think there's been a emphasis on a particular kind of intelligence in AI conversations or in machine learning conversations, or just the progression of human-computer interface, that the focus in particular on the kinds of intelligence and problem solving that those of us who work in the industry value has become elevated to some pinnacle of the pinnacle of human intelligence, which in reality there's so many different kinds of intelligence that human beings process. And in particular, thinking about the realm of disability, which is the anchor, accessibility being the anchor of inclusive design, with the multiple sensory ways that people bring information in. If someone is who's both deaf and blind, will have different methods of translators who will communicate emotional information through touch. The ways that we're processing smell with sight, and that we don't understand these in our own abilities well yet. How could we understand those intelligence in terms of superiority? And I think also that just understanding even different types of cognition, the different ways that people focus, the different ways that we learn and process information, that as we take a closer look into these realms of who's excluded from technology. If we think about aging populations or very, very young populations, or globally different communities that maybe have different access, you start to see different ways that people solve those problems, those access problems in their own lives that are highly intelligent, that never would have been solved in that way by a group of engineers in Silicon Valley. And so I think there's something to the question of what is human intelligence and the way that manifests that we're very afraid when we think about human intelligence in that very monolithic way. But the more we understand about our own complexity, the more we'll understand where that lives and how valuable it is.
I'm much less concerned about artificial intelligence as I am artificial stupidity. Which goes back to some of the things Tron said. Kat, my last quote question. John Seely Brown said, the technology is the easy part. The hard part is figuring out the social and institutional structures around the technology. It seems like you've devoted your career to that. So what are your thoughts?
That's a great quote. One thing that's been on my mind lately is the nature of technology, the nature of especially commercialized technology has been very focused on the individual. So there's a lot of talk about personalization of an experience or a product or a technology. But the reality is that human beings exist in complex systems of relationships, that all of the things that we interact with are complex systems on top of complex systems. I think in particular in the United States, we have an emphasis on a very the pioneer mentality. We love to tell the story of like the lone cowboy or the lone astronaut or the lone startup entrepreneur who was such a genius in his dorm room or garage or wherever it was. And we rarely tell the story of all the human beings that were part of making that a reality. And I think that that is inherent in the way that we, in many companies, think about the design of technology. We tend to talk about human-centered design or human-centered products as something with this person in the middle, right? We're designing it for Joe or Anne. The challenge of that is who exactly belongs in the center of that human-centered design. And who you swap in changes the criteria that you would choose to favor. And historically, the way that we've built, like the 80-20 rule, we would say, hey, you design or engineer a product to work for 80% of the population, the 20% edge case will kind of take care of itself or come along over time. And all of these this bell curve mentality is rooted in a very old but designed mental model about human beings, that there is such a thing as normal. And then if you collect enough data, and you average it out and you take the middle of that data, that you get some representation of some perfect human being. And Adolphe Quetelet was the astronomer and mathematician who really fathered that work. It still permeates our society today. Our body mass index and whatever that tells us about normalcy of obesity or health, it's really the Quetelet index. It's permeated so many places. And so when we think about how much we've adopted this thinking about a normal human being as the iconic, center of these technologies, but it's all based on this assumption that we made, this mental model that was constructed. And as we know more and more, it's just not true in the way people interact with each other or the way they interact with the world. But how do we then create a new mental model of thinking about people as we design technology? How do we think about that diversity? So I think, the element of, what we make, starting with thinking about who either is most able to use it, who is most unable to use it, just looking for those other models that can give us a starting point for design, because now the technologies can adapt. We can make them work for many, many diverse people, but the challenge is, where do you start? And if you, take that bell curve and say, I'm going to start in the middle because I think I'm going to cover most cases, I think of just finding in many, many companies that is absolutely not true. And everybody's starting to feel like an edge case, and everybody's starting to feel outpaced by the technologies in their lives. So what needs to change to bring companies and engineers and designers into a new way of thinking about people?
There's an element to that I am curious about. So if we're talking about the idea where, the mass that is the center, the center of the bell curve is in fact not representative of enough people to really be fully inclusive. Well, so we can adjust our qualitative methods when we're analysing a population to address that relatively easily. We can be much more about, instead of looking about people in the middle, let's find as many edge cases as possible and understand that diversity. However, as soon as we start talking about anything where it's quantitative, it all falls apart, because almost all statistical methods that we use for analysing populations and for example, understanding what an average thing looks like, or what proportion of people are there, they're all based on the assumption of normality, the normal distribution, that everything's a normal distribution. So have you, either of you guys looked at that sort of thing? Like, are there quantitative techniques that are able to address diversity like that?
It's such a good question, because I think, I was having this argument with a family member who's a public health officer, and you're saying, no, quantitative is really good. Like, quantitative tells me where disease is likely to show up. Quantitative tells me where, diagnosis can happen at large scale. And I think perhaps a nuance is that when we take too much emphasis in one or the other, because both a quantitative or qualitative or a big data or a thick data and with a small set of people gives us some orientation towards a set of decisions then that we make. And I think the challenge is if we've only consumed a quantitative method and then make decisions at the individual level, and how much are we missing in terms of considerations about the individual needs of the individual human being, as opposed to also, on the other end, biasing too heavily on, I've designed something well for Bob, and now I'm going to translate and assume that that works for everybody else. So I think what we're seeing now is a question of where do we find the balance between big and thick, perhaps? Where are we missing methods, especially in the quantitative, from a design standpoint, and translating what we know works well statistically, but then what works in practical application? But I do think there's a lot of missing practices that we can still discover.
Well, this sounds like a conversation for us to have in more depth later, because I don't want to get into math right now.
No on the math. So I think what's really interesting about the conversation so far is there is this. So increasingly, I'm interested in learning more about cultural inclusivity in interface design, and then what if any, is there a distinction of? Is there a distinction between a passive inclusivity, where you design the system to allow the maximum amount of people in, or is there also a more proactive inclusivity, where you're designing into your interfaces experiences to teach people about exclusive language use? Or I'm thinking of Alexa's sad bleep of disengagement when you say something derogatory toward a feminine identity. She goes bleep, bloop, bloop, and just won't engage you if you say something not cool, profane. One of my students is really interested to see, like, well, isn't this also an opportunity to use voice, which people think is really powerful, in order to gain empathy and try and engage people about things and teach them to go upstream? I saw downstream earlier on the word cloud, and try and get people beyond the interface instead of just teaching them how to use the interface differently.
I want to do a brief setup for our next poll question, and I think this is kind of germane to where this conversation's going. Brief explanation. Boeing and Airbus, the two major airline producers in the world, have very different approaches to flying the plane. Boeing gives the pilot freedom to push the envelope. Airbus aircraft are actually programmed to ignore the pilot if the pilot goes outside of certain safety parameters. One pilot complained that flying an Airbus plane, instead of feeling the plane with the yoke, it's like playing a video game. So there's very different philosophies of, I want the computer flying the plane, no, I want the pilot flying the plane. So I think that's a fairly interesting representation of how much we trust computers versus humans. So I'd like to ask you all the question, if you're going to book your flight and you can decide whether you want the computer flying the plane or the pilot, which would you prefer? Answer, poll question. The pilot is A, the computer is B. Go.
I just don't want them to argue.
Oh, there it is.
That point's really important, actually, that you don't want them to argue.
Oh, I didn't know we had results. Panel, how do you feel about the fact that the computer kicked the pilot's butt?
The thing he said about he doesn't want them to argue, I think that's actually really critical.
You can give the option of both.
No, that's not a good option. We had to force your choice.
That's really very middle of the
We had
ground.
to force it.
Well, so the Air France plane that went down on the way back from Brazil, 5-10 years ago, it was largely due to a conflict between the computer and the pilot. And the interesting thing about it is it started out with the computer being wrong, and it ended with the pilot being wrong. And the pilot being wrong was much, much worse than the computer being wrong. So what happened was that the computer was wrong because one of its sensors on the outside of the plane was iced over, one of its pressure sensors, I think, and therefore it was giving incorrect altitude information. And so it was, I don't know exactly what it was doing. It was doing something crazy, and they've listened in on this is all from the flight recorder. And so it started dropping precipitously. And in the normal circumstances, it would drop, and the thing would unice, and then it would capture. It's obviously not an ideal thing, but it's a thing that's happened before, and they have designed for. There's like 8 of these sensors. However, in this particular case, when the pilot saw that the plane was doing this strange thing in reaction to this problem, he decided to take over, and he did various things that eventually put it into a stall, and essentially just plowed into the ground because he was trying to put it into a situation because he misunderstood what the computer was doing to rectify a problem that he didn't understand. And so the problem there wasn't one of them or the other, it was the interaction between them.
Does this result surprise you, or is this what you guys would have expected?
I've done this as an exercise. Actually, the exercise we do often with young students and then a lot of companies is what would you only trust a computer to do and what would you only trust a human being to do? And there's something about planes that's okay, but a car isn't. And then you definitely don't want a computer deciding what you're going to wear for the day. Like, that's what I've discerned across all age groups. So there's like these fascinating emotional barriers.
What do you think is the distinction between those categories? Is it
I'm
the
sorry?
fact? What do you think is the distinction between those categories? Is it the fact that one of them is very personal, or is it something else?
Judgment, I think. Like taste.
Taste.
And judgment, and again, back to intellect and intelligence and things that we hold as uniquely human. That's my guess.
And value.
Yeah, value.
I mean, humans feel their way around. That's how we discover morality. We're like, oh, we're going to build out an ethical argument for this thing that we feel is right or wrong. And we kind of feel there. Where, you know, flying a plane, there's a lot of variables, and we don't really want our feels getting in the way. It's interesting to think about maybe, I wonder if maybe in like 10 or 15 years we would be more comfortable with cars driving on the road. Because right now it seems really
Yeah.
a lot of,
I worry I wonder if the reason people are so much more comfortable, one of the reasons why people are more comfortable with the plane situation, I worry a lot more about pilots falling asleep than I worry about drivers falling asleep. It's, you know, it's 12 hours in the air on a long distance flight. Maybe they ought to have something doing the work for them.
Kat, I'm not making fun of Microsoft by phrasing this question this way.
I'm not
I know, you're no
protective.
longer there.
It's okay.
But I'm guessing you had a few times where you beat your head against the wall arguing for more inclusive design. And I'm curious about, having spent all this time in the trenches, are you noticing a difference? Are people appreciating the opportunities for innovation from Talk about where things are at in terms of inclusion.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. That's the reason I quit, was not because they weren't supportive at Microsoft, but because so many other people were interested. And so, we say things like Microsoft, and that represents 100,000 people, right? And what I am very proud of is when Satya Nadella became CEO, it kind of marked also a moment of a shift in stated values, but I think there were values that were inherent already to many of those 100,000 people. So we were able to make really great progress with this very pragmatic approach to inclusion because it resonated with a community of people who enjoy problem solving, enjoy technology as a problem solving method. When I left a year ago, it was because there were so many companies that responded to the toolkit, and I made it very open, published it all actually externally before internally, because one of the tricks of any large company is to get somebody externally to validate what you're doing, and then they all think it's like, oh, this company's doing it, we should do it too. So there was this echo back, but the echo was far louder than we thought it would be. And the number of companies who wanted to practice this was surprising. In the last year, for a number of reasons that I think are serendipitous and cultural, and then also some very negative publicity moments for a lot of companies, the word inclusion as a marker has spiked, like just as a, so I get many inquiries that are, inclusion, I want that. How do I get that? And the first question is, what do you mean by inclusion? And I think it happens often in the technology industry, is we find, in the same way that we get excited about holograms, or we get excited about self-driving cars, inclusion's having that kind of moment right now as well. Trying to be opportunistic about that and diving in and saying, let's have a conversation about being really clear about what that means in our practices. And I think the first thing, there's two things that always come up in terms of resistance that people meet. First is a fear of saying the wrong thing. So if I'm going to step into this space, I feel like I'm afraid it's full of minefields. It's a minefield. I'm going to step on something, and it's going to, not go well. So language has become a very important first step in that. And then the second part is business rationale, and how do I tie this to a business justification? So helping companies make that connection that moving inclusion out of the margins and into a primary conversation, that it's not some other community of people, it's actually all of us who at some point in our lives are going to experience disability, at some point in our lives are going to need accessibility, that in any room, I've never been in a room, one of the things people often say is, I don't know anybody with a disability, I don't know how to start this work, and there's never been in a room that I've been in where somebody at the end doesn't come up to me and say, like, this resonates on a personal level because either they experience a disability or someone in their life does. And so I think that there's a resistance because it hasn't been a conversation. And as we find better language and we find better tools, I've seen very low resistance in the last year. We'll see if it's a trend.
I'm sensing there's at least one person in this room who wants to argue for inclusion on a project they've been working on. Do you have a killer metaphor, a killer story, a line that's worked for you that you can give them that they can use to push their project?
The argument?
Yeah.
Ooh, you put me on the spot. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, so there's two things I say at least 20 times a week with the work I do. The first is there are over 1 billion people in the world who have a disability. That's according to the World Health Organization's World Report on Disability in 2011. That also means that there are 6.4 billion people who are temporarily able-bodied. And so it is something we are all going to experience, and if you want to talk about breakdown of market, we can get into that. Like, that's the conversation I start with. But then the second piece, in tying it to what it is that we are all, I think, interested in terms of technology, is that the World Health Organization also redefined disability in 2001 as a mismatched interaction between the features of a person's body and the features of the environment in which they live. And so where for many, many years we've talked about disability as a personal health condition, there's a pivot that's happened where it's really about the design of the environments, the design of the products, fitting or not fitting a human being. And so that places a responsibility on the business leaders, the product makers, the engineers, the designers. Every choice we make, it raises or lowers those mismatches that people experience.
As the parent of a child on the autism spectrum, you're triggering something in my mind, which is I've learned to never use the word normal, but to use the word typical as another variation on that. Do you guys have anything you want to throw in here on this topic?
You're talking about autism there. While you're talking, when we say disability, most of the time people think of physical disability, right? So, your hand doesn't work, so you can't use a two-handed controller. Well, what about the element of disability which is due to psychological limitations? So autism is a good example. People have very specific, what we would call pathological conditions, but also people who are just, say, for example, disabled through depression. Is there much work going on in how do you design things to support people like that?
And so you said disabled through?
I'm really interested in the aspects of mental health that are where we're so commonly disabled. So people who have some level of anxiety, designing things to support those people who have depression or any number of things, confidence issues. Is there much work looking at how you do inclusion around people like that?
That's a great question, because another statistic is that 70% of disabilities are invisible. And so it kind of conflates back to the conversation about intelligence and human intelligence, that the diversity of ways that people solve problems, the diversity of disabilities in both the cognition, intellectual, and there's a growing amount of work just to discern the human mind, I think, in a way that we can then parse out where there's a match or mismatch with certain products or certain solutions. And so as an example, when I was working at Microsoft, OneNote you may be familiar with. It's like a version of Word, but in the cloud is how I think about it. But we did some work with students with dyslexia and dysgraphia to design different reading assistive tools inside of this product. And what we learned in that process is the different types of visual cues, highlighting text, calling out parts of grammar, doing audio reading of text and highlighting as we went through. Ended up being great for students with dyslexia, but also ended up working well for anybody who is learning a new language. And so the two primary customers for that product ended up being the State Board of Education in Tennessee and then the government of Qatar for some reason. Like, never would have categorized those two cultures or demographics together. So there's these new opportunities of discovery, I think, as we get to know those nuances of human cognition, but then also disability in that lens that helps us really think about solving problems in technology in a new way.
I want to ask two quick questions of the gentlemen on the panel, and then we're going to open up for Q&A for all of you. So, Miles, you talk about human-machine interfaces not argument neutral. Talk about that.
They'll argue for anyone. If you can build it, it'll argue for you. So earlier I was talking about the vaccine ingredients calculator. What's really interesting about the idea that we can make machines that argue for us is that increasingly it's super easy to do. With very little effort, you can make your own interface that does some kind of processing and has a database and returns values. When you're engaging in something like a knowledge-based system, which we've had since the 60s, you go to this terminal and you ask it some questions about geometry and it helps you make a decision real quick. Based within that tradition, increasingly people are able to just make their own machines. And so if you can imagine a machine as a little arguer, a little performer, that we go and we grab and we're like, hey, I need you to argue for me. And they're like, I guess because I have no morals. I'm a robot. They literally are not valued. They will argue for anyone, and they can be commissioned to argue for anyone. And so I think that the big learning moment from that, hopefully, is that we're thinking about programming as this new kind of a rhetoric, thinking about being conversant and using machine learning as a new kind of, at least a rhetorical resource, something that we can source to make arguments and be persuasive.
Tron, you talk about increasing kindness and breaking down the walls of the echo chamber.
Yeah, so this is just how sometimes you go through like a month of thinking about an idea. This is something that was floating around my head a lot a few months ago. So I work and I do a lot with virtual reality, and I run hackathons here in Seattle. So we run one of these like every 6 months, and we've had all sorts of topics. And one topic that sort of was popping into my head a couple of months ago about something that would be really interesting to explore is how can we talk a lot about in virtual reality about how technology helps us build empathy. Or specifically how VR can help us build empathy, because it can put us into the situation or the body of a person who's not us, and we can understand their trials, the challenges they face, and so forth. And then I listened to a podcast with someone talking about a book called Against Empathy, where he was talking about how too much empathy can actually be harmful. But then he was really, really careful about his definitions. He was talking about empathy as in feeling the emotion of someone else who is feeling the emotion. So it's maybe not actually helpful to be angry when you see someone else who's angry, which makes a certain amount of sense. But he was saying that you shouldn't use his argument to then undermine the role of sympathy and the role of compassion. And so if we're thinking about how do we use virtual reality for teaching people empathy and to feel other people's pain, how can we use technology to teach ourselves or teach each other to be more compassionate? And I don't have any easy answers to this. I've been thinking about things, and the best example I've thought about is technology that helps us engage in nurturing behaviours. So I'm thinking everything here from like, say, a virtual Zen garden, but things that give us opportunities to see something that needs help and be like, yeah, I can help you, I'm going to do that. And to practice that and to do that over time. And so it's an idea for a type of technology that I'd like to see explored more. But I don't have a solution to it, obviously. If I did have a solution, I'd be out there doing it. But it's a thing I think we should be thinking about more.
I'm a believer in gapology. Have we had any gaps so far? Have we missed anything in the conversation that you want to mention? Anything come to mind that you haven't had a hook to bring up?
You could ask them about this poll.
I could ask him about this poll. Tell me about the poll question.
Who's really going to be in charge in 25 years?
In charge.
The lizards.
I'm on the side of the humans.
Ben really liked lizards and Barron Trump a lot in this poll question.
Do you get the lizards reference? Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Anyone?
I thought it was
No
just
one?
a generic Illuminati
No
thing,
one?
but
All right.
I think it ultimately
42.
failed, but it was a good try, Ben.
Thank you.
Any questions? We have 2 mics up here in the front if you want to come and ask the panelists any questions.
And if somebody wants to pose a poll, come on up.
You get control of the screen.
No, I'm not going that far.
Can we have a round of applause for our first questioner? Thank you.
A lot of people seem to have a very strong aversion to the idea of machines making decisions about killing human beings. In war, recently, most of the injuries and deaths are friendly fire accidents. Human beings are miserable at deciding to kill other human beings. Why do you think we as a society have such a aversion to turning this over to perhaps a better decision maker?
I think it's for, in large part, fear of how we would set the rules for that. It's not that I have a problem with the idea that a computer might be able to make decisions about which target is a friend and which target is a foe. I worry that the rules that the machine is given are things that it will follow stupidly, without compassion, and that I don't know what those rules are, and I don't know what the process is. So honestly, the piece I trust there the least is the institutions that would set those rules, not the machines themselves.
I think it's also important to note that it's not like battle bots. You know, it's not like we're making robots, seeing who made the better robot, and they're going to go fight robots on robots. I mean, I wish that's what it was. It would be, I think, a much more pleasant place to be in the world. But in reality, what we're talking about is robots killing people. And so I would say I would be working from a Kantian framework, specifically around the idea of moral patiency, or that some entities have a moral dignity that others don't. So for instance, if I smash a microwave, nobody's really going to care. But if I smashed a kitten, people would think I was heinous. Or if I smashed a human baby, even worse. And so I think it's the problem of building an agent to kill a particular entity that doesn't share the same kind of risk to its own moral patiency.
I think there's also an aspect of accountability that is very relevant to large company scale products. And you have 15,000 people working on something like Windows, or hundreds of thousands of developers working to create one system. Who's accountable if that system creates harm to another human being? And so I think there's also an element of question that people have around who's accountable if the machine delivers the impact, the death. Yeah.
I think probably society also just has a certain level of distrust. We've got so much culture telling us that, you've got computer powers and the computer will get power hungry, go crazy, and then you get millions of robots. So I suspect there's probably a bit of that sort of narrative fear that's out there as well. But I think that's actually the least interesting of the reasons why we're scared of it.
I love the fact that Ben's putting polls up here and we're not seeing them. So it's really, you all
I'm loving
know
the
more
fact
than
that,
we
that Ben's
do.
an answer to this poll.
I love that about you.
Did you see this one?
Ben Wheatgraph.
We get the eggplant?
That was one of my buddies, I promise you.
There was some discussion that had, I guess, some overlapping themes. And one was how to use it to benefit humanity. What is the proper role for it? What is the difference between a human pilot and a computer one? And I wanted to kind of bring it into one question, I guess. So I think that human consciousness is not really well defined yet. I'm not exactly sure where it's at. And even if we define sentient as like total self-awareness, there's some debate that humans lack that. For example, if I say tomorrow's the day I'm going to start exercising and then I don't, an hour later I wonder who was that guy that didn't get up. So it seems to be that consciousness kind of is not what we exactly think it is, and we're not as aware, and the ego has a nice way of protecting us and insulating us from that reality that we're not as aware as we think. And one of the things that I think about in respect of that is, sure, it'll be extremely dangerous when a computer is as we imagine it is to be aware, because it will know more about us than we will ever know in an hour, and it will easily be able to move us around. Before we get to that danger, though, there is something that I think humans can have a massive benefit to. And rather than focusing on the outliers and the extreme psychopaths and stuff, maybe we can noise them out by focusing on how to make, let's say, the mean distribution happier, rather than trying to correct everyone by focusing on the outliers. And what I mean is using, for example, a bot or other things to treat depression. So how to make each other treat each other better. So if I have a bot that, like in a Carl Jung kind of way, refocuses my priorities in life at that moment, I'm like, shit, you know, yes, life is great. And then I go into Starbucks and I leave $1 tip because I'm in a good mood. And then I become like the 5 people nearest me, and they become like me. And then those psychopaths and other outliers, they become, let's say, peer pressured into pretending anyway to share our empathy. Back to the empathy discussion. So maybe the way to bring out more empathy in people is to focus on making the mean distribution themselves less moody and more positive. Because I think that the argument is that if you have a better relationship with a computer, you will disregard people. I think that's not the case. I think that if I had a computer that was a friend in a Carl Jung kind of way, I'll be even better to other people. Because then I'm not miserable, I'm not unhappy.
Yeah, that's kind of the idea I was talking about with nurturing, is that you're creating a thing that you're relating to like that.
And I want to know what your opinions are on focusing on human interface and also just making people, in a Carl Jung kind of way, refocusing their life to be more positive, because I think that solves a lot of problems. And I think one of the single biggest problems in the world is depression. It even has resulted in world leaders doing things that are very bizarre. It causes lots of problems. And I think that's just because we overstate our intelligence. We're not as sophisticated as we think. And
Okay,
so
let's give the panel
What do you
a shot.
think about that?
Anybody want to react?
I'm going back to the word cloud, the first one with the word, the fear word cloud, and humans was on there in multiple ways. And I think that back to then this other word cloud with the word transparency, the way that we treat each other leads, there's such a, I'm going to put it this way, the trust that human beings put in each other is maybe the best indicator of how much we're going to trust technology. Because whether it's we believe there's human beings who make that technology, we don't believe in, we don't trust the human beings that are making that technology, or we don't really understand how to establish trust with one another in a lot of contexts as well. How can a machine, or how can we train a machine to do that? I think there's an element in what you're talking about of, when we talk about human-to-machine technology, or sorry, human-to-machine interaction, first understanding what human-to-human interaction is and how that works is still a mystery to so many of us. And so that can be an anchor in one way to have better conversations about human-to-machine interactions. Transparency being an example of how do people create trust. Back to digital assistants or personal assistants, the way that an assistant creates trust with a client is by recording the elements that they're learning about their client and then sitting down and going through and making sure that they're accurate in those assumptions. And there's mechanisms we have to build transparency, and there's mechanisms we have to create trust in some relationships, but it's not widely understood as a broad topic in how we design technology in similar ways.
Yeah, I think that habit is the entry point. It's if you can get a bot trained on a particular psychotherapeutic approach. And in fact, one of the first chatbots was made by Weizenbaum, who was trained on a Rogerian psychotherapist. And it would basically like, oh, that sounds neat. Can you say more about that? And it would just like take whatever you said and then ask an open-ended question, which was hugely successful according to Weizenbaum. He says because people anthropomorphized the bot. I say because they knew it was a bot and they could confide in it. And in the sense of like working into these habits where like we get into the habit of practicing interacting with real people with a bot, I do think there's a lot of potential there. I mean, the question came up in class the other night, Can we make counselor bots that train people on how to have interactions with people that say really outlandish, bizarre things, or might be difficult to interact with in a productive way?
Especially when they can start talking like the recent Google demonstration.
Oh, yeah. and then recapture the kinds of like paralanguage things that are going on outside of the specific words that we're using. Absolutely.
The panel might want to check out this poll question.
I've been giggling as we go.
I like that Hal got voted
The
highest.
emoji is my favorite.
Or the,
Is it one person doing all these emojis, or do we have a bunch of different?
I think it's actually in this case at least two.
That's the
Given the
question
font
that I
size.
want.
It's Kevin Lenaway.
One thing that occurs to me is that in our discussion of whether or not to fear the upcoming apocalypse or what have you, and let's just assume that we're talking about the achievement of consciousness in the silicon-based life form or what have you, however you want to frame it. I think a key assumption that we're all making is that the time from now to then is really a function of software and hardware, and getting better software and faster and cheaper hardware, more expansive and networking and everything. Based on our discussion, or your discussion, your comments about statistics, normalization, the standard distribution, and so on and so forth, this is my question. Is that the case, or do we need an entirely new mathematical approach to the problem in order to truly achieve consciousness?
Searle would say so.
I just want to point out that
When are you going to do it?
I want to point out that Kat pointed to Tron. So
Okay.
Tron, you've been
So,
nominated.
if you're a philosopher, you'll go out there and read Searle. He wrote a lot about, I think 100%, 90% sure it's Searle, was writing about the nature of consciousness in machines. And one of the things he talks about is the idea of a Chinese room, which I won't go into, but it's fascinating. But from that work, there was this whole idea of connectionism, that the symbol processing approach that computers use, the argument is that fundamentally a symbol processing machine is incapable of being intelligent in the way that humans are. And from there you get connectionism. And you could argue that for example, deep learning and these neural network type approaches are essentially modeling that, but then the argument is that's a discrete modeling as opposed to a continuous modeling. So if you're paying attention to these philosophical arguments, there's strong reasons to believe that maybe the way in which processing happens in the brain is fundamentally different to the way in which processing happens in a computer, and we just don't know. And there's some very good distinct distinctions between them. That one about it being analog and continuous versus linear and discrete. There's reasons I think that may be an issue. Obviously, we have no idea whether that's the case, but it's definitely been well argued.
Anybody else on this one?
I probably should just be like, that was great, because, but there is this interesting challenge from building on that from a design standpoint, deterministic versus non-deterministic outcomes, like thinking about how something will play out because it's been programmed a particular way, and how to design for that outcome versus I have no idea how this thing is going to learn the nature of where it could evolve as it does and what it encounters along the way. So how do we design experiences that can anticipate that? So back to mathematical models, but also I think just straight up design practices, like it all needs rethinking in this inflection point.
So with the issue of Google Duplex, after that came out, some people said, well, you really need to have a disclaimer, someone saying this conversation you're having is going to be with a bot because it's helping so-and-so make this appointment. And related to that, Elon Musk has said that you need to have regulation for AI. Should there be a new regulatory framework created for this, like a federal AI commission, or should we just rely on the regulators who are out there already for telephone calls, for example?
Or should we let the machines manage themselves? That was a joke.
I know there was a degree of progress towards that with the previous administration. There was a lot of, I don't mean that, sorry, but there literally was. There were a lot of dedicated frameworks and elements that were being built around that. I think those are continuing in places, but it's a question that's very much on policymakers, a degree of policymakers' minds. I might adapt into one subcategory of what you're talking about in terms of the accountability or the responsibilities that an engineer or designer or developer personally commits to when entering this discipline, this profession. And we have professions that you take oaths, you have certain types of criteria you have to pass because you're now crossing into, people's lives are in your hands. And I think we're seeing this become that kind of weight. And there is, I think, a question to ask in terms of what are the kinds of commitments that we require of the people who are making these technologies, either from a, professional certificate or ethics and philosophy required criteria to become a developer. And then is there some oath that we take before we commit to making products that impact society in these ways?
I would also say that there's a good proxy in Twitter bots. So not only did Twitter rewrite their terms of use so that you can't use bots to fake humans, and they actually ended up purging a bunch of bots, which basically are constructing social capital for particular movements. There's also a senator in one of the counties in LA who, Hertzberg, I think is his name. He passed some legislation basically requiring that if you have automation on a social media account, it needs to designate itself as such, which I think is kind of similar to what you're asking about in the sense that we're faking a human which we give a particular value, and when those entities speak, we give it a particular kind of weight that we wouldn't just a machine, and so when we're faking it, and I'm thinking of robocalls, this is like the new version of robocalls in the duplex, except it's working for individuals instead of companies.
Okay, I'm alerting the panel that at the very end, I'm going to ask you to do kind of a 1-minute close. So just start thinking about that. I think you're next.
Quick question.
Quick, let's keep the questions really short.
So it's kind of two-part, but we're talking about the end of the bell curve as being effective for designing for people's needs because it doesn't represent maybe the more personal qualitative need. It doesn't go, I think you said depth and stuff. So 2 questions. How do you make the business case for supporting those edge cases that don't have an ROI value? And the second, how do you do that alternative use of data when you're talking about depth versus width?
We can talk more afterwards. At a shorthand, I'd say I'd bias towards removing the bell curve from the conversation entirely and talk more about the goal of a product or a business and then who is most unable to participate in that. So if it is a water park in San Antonio, Texas, right? Traditionally, water parks are very inaccessible to children who use wheelchairs. And the way to think about the business case is if you design a park that works well for a child who uses a wheelchair, it will also work well for someone who's temporarily injured, which, that is a much larger population, or someone who, because of a, certain situation, they're dragging a suitcase behind them. I don't know why they'd have a suitcase in the water park, but they're dragging a suitcase behind them, or they're on a skateboard or something, that there's access for somebody because of the circumstances as well. And so I've been calling that a persona spectrum. There's a continuum of ability, that it's not just that most excluded community, it's not just someone who's blind, but if we design a product that works well for someone who's blind, it works out well also for somebody has an injury or who might be driving a car and doesn't have use of their eyes and needs to use a voice-based system. So drawing that out helps debunk there is no market there, and also helps demonstrate the connection to the broader product innovation potential. But we can chat more. Yeah.
Lightning round questions.
So I've noticed recently that there's a lot of frustration with people dealing with bots for customer service and IT support. And it seems to be more on the issue of the person trying to contact. They might not be able to articulate their issue, for example. Do you think there are places where bots and AI maybe aren't so helpful?
I have to interrupt for a second. I love the John Mulaney line that we spend most of our day trying to convince robots that we're not a robot.
I haven't heard that. So the question was, are there places where bots are not useful, not helpful? Oh, yeah.
I was on the phone with the IRS this morning. That probably sums it up.
That's an
Unhelpful. I'd say absolutely. I mean, there's a vast, the question maybe is, where are they helpful? There's a lot of kinds of, from a human-machine relationship standpoint, we tend to historically offload the things we find least appealing to a machine, right? We don't want to do the stamping the package over and over again. Let's find a machine to do that. And I think that, so there's a category that seems to be comfortable for a large portion of the society to say, okay, those are things that are okay, but it starts really to get very blurry very quickly, right?
I think any place where the human in the interaction perceives there to be ambiguity that they need to resolve. I don't want to have a bot anywhere near when I'm trying to resolve an ambiguity, but if I know exactly what I want and I'm just pressing the buttons, I'm totally happy with it being a bot.
I think that all bots right now are bad. If it has to do with a question that you can't foresee that your user is going to ask. But in the same regard, there are bots that are very effective because we know all the questions that somebody's going to ask. So I'm thinking of Georgia State they tested out using a bot with their incoming cohort in 2016. And what they did was they split their incoming cohort 50-50. And they had one group opt in to get text message bot support, and then the other half would go to your traditional registrar and admissions office and counselor for advice. And what they noticed, which is really interesting, the first generation college attendees that were in the bot case tended to use the bot more than they would have ordinarily if they were going to engage an admissions office. So they actually got all of the support that they needed because those are just questions that we would ask over and over again anyway, including, for instance, filling out the FAFSA. Do you all remember this? Oh my God, the Federal Application for Financial Student Aid, or I probably got the acronym wrong. It's a scary form to fill out. And you need a lot of guidance, especially if you don't have somebody there who's done it before. And in that case, the bot is very effective.
There's a huge cultural component as well. Just, you mentioned earlier the Tay bot that went haywire on Twitter, that there was almost directly similar technology that was released in China, Zhao Weiss, that has, I think, over 40 million users who converse with it on a daily basis in almost like a relationship, like a romantic relationship kind of way in many cases. And so it's interesting, that question of what's right and does that demonstrate success or that it's right? I don't know, but it is interesting that culturally the variation is huge in terms of what is acceptable.
Okay, quick question. This is the lightning round.
So a lot of the conversation has been around, and this is in general too, not just this forum, but computers and humans separately. But Elon Musk talks about how in order to keep up with AI, we might have to interface with AI directly. So I want to hear your guys' opinion on like neural lace, if you're familiar with that, and what the impacts might be of that kind of human-computer interface.
I am not familiar with,
I'm not familiar with Elon Musk's specific
really
thing, but the concept of that kind of merging, that you would have an AI, some kind of AI laced into your brain or into your consciousness in such a way that you're able to use it as part of your regular processing, has been around and certainly sci-fi and elsewhere in the literature for a while. And I think he's probably right that something like that is inevitable, and I suspect it's going to be something that comes on us very slowly, right? We're in this process where now, say 20 years ago, I had an information system that could help me do things. We talked about the information superhighway and how it was going to make us smarter. And to do that, I had to sit down at a chair, I had to type, and I had to fiddle around with a crappy old version of my Netscape browser. But eventually I'd get the information I wanted. Well, now it's on my pocket, it's on my phone. And we're moving towards augmented reality, where it's going to be floating in the space in front of me, and I can just sort of, see it ambiently while I'm in the world. And each of these is a step towards it being more accessible in terms of, we can get it very quickly. We don't have to do work for it. It's invisibly, well, the work is being done invisibly in the background to provide us with that thing. And I think things like that, where it is more closely integrated with us, will just continue to happen. Whether we end up sticking like actual machines in our brain to achieve that is an entirely different problem, because there's some very, very big biological problems around that in terms of rejecting that material from your brain. But it's definitely going to happen. If that's the thing you're interested, go read a book, Accelerando by Charles Stross. He basically deals with it. It's a great book, but his character in that at some point loses access to what he refers to as his metacortex, and he's essentially brain damaged for a period of time, because he no longer has access to all of these resources and abilities to think that he used to have, that were just, second nature, and they weren't with him anymore. He wanders around effectively like he's been kicked in the head.
Okay, last question.
So if you think about the way we interact with our digital space or machines today, the conventions we use to interact with them, they haven't really fundamentally improved or changed in the last 20 years, or since the invention of computers. For example, the way we display data from products to files, search results, we're limiting ourselves to displaying them in a list view or table view. The way we use our camera apps on touchscreen devices, the interface originated from the interface of Leica 1 in the 1920s. If you look at the latest AR interfaces, they're still using tiny little buttons in a fixed positions, as if we're still trying to scroll, point, and click with our mouse or pointer. So all these conventions we're still using today, are we using them now because they're truly the best, the most beautiful, efficient, interesting way to interact with our digital space? Or are we using them just because we don't want to change?
Such a good question, because the evolution of user interface design in particular, right? You start to get that same icon grid that was in the first GUIs is now shrunken way, way down on these tiny, tiny little interfaces that we wear, and then we're trying to figure out what the right navigation models are for something that becomes purely auditory. So I think the nature of that evolution it's at a point where it's compressed. It's a point where that model is breaking, those paradigms are breaking. Back to culture, I think something that's, I'm just learning about, the broader cultures of how AI first interfaces are coming about in regions around the world. And I think that the United States and countries with similar income levels is very screen-oriented. Right? We'll have 10 screens in one family's household, right? And the ways that we interact with it. So we tend to bias visually first. In a culture where that type of income wasn't available, a mobile phone might have an LCD on it and is primarily text first or voice first. Interacting with AI for the first time through a voice and text experience is an entirely different framing of what user interface should be and how it should work. And so what I'm seeing is the design of interfaces coming from China and coming from India and regions of South America is pushing the innovation of how we think about user interface design in the United States. And I believe it will outpace our design practices here because we are so visually biased. We've trained generations of designers as graphic derivative, right? So literally there's no one, there are just now some designers trained in how to do voice-based interaction.
I think there's also some biases implicit in the way that we culturally structure information and decision making. So if you think about an icon-based interface, well, an icon-based interface is very good for making a choice between discrete options. So I have 10 options. I'm choosing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these things. I choose this one. A grid makes sense for that sort of thing. Visual grids are really good. I can inspect it simultaneously and randomly. I can look at whichever things I know are right. I can remember the location of things. So there's a lot of reasons built into the way that we make decisions that sort of drive us towards those interfaces, but it's also important to note that the way that we think about decision making is also really cultural. Like, and I'm not a cultural science person here, but my understanding is, some cultures are much more dialogue based. It's much more about a push and pull of information. And that sort of situation, the UIs that we are based around just don't work in the same one.
Okay, want to explain to the panel that I'm going to do a minute talking about sponsors, and then each of you is going to come up with a short idea or nugget to blow the audience away before they leave. So think about that while I do this. I'd like to first off thank our sponsors, Seattle University, the MIT Enterprise Forum, Ben and Paul, amazing people, Town Hall. Can we have a round of applause? Just wonderful sponsors. Another brief commercial moment for each of our panelists. Trond is a board member of the Virtual World Society. He organizes and supports immersive technology hackathons. If you want to find out more about those, talk to this man. Miles, the Digital Technology and Cultures program has monthly public lectures from experts to address technology issues about art, science, politics from a humanities perspective. You have to talk to this man if you want to find out more about that.
Let's nerd
Somebody
out.
in the audience just gave a thumbs up to that. So there you go. You're getting support right there. And Kat, and we're not sucking up here, has a book coming out from the MIT Press, Mismatch, How Inclusion Shapes Design. You can pre-order it today or buy it in the bookstore in September. A soon-to-be author sitting right amidst us. It's an amazing thing. So could we have, before they come up with their summary, just to motivate them, could we have a good round of applause for this panel? Now I'm just going to be blunt. Blow them away, kids. Trond.
I'm going to talk about invisible interfaces. I mean, sort of vaguely went in that direction. I was talking about the neural lace thing, about how it's slowly going to disappear into our heads. But there's been an idea floating around called ubiquitous computing, where the idea is the computing is all around us and we don't have to see the interfaces. And I've been convinced for quite a while that augmented reality is the way that you do this. Essentially, the idea here is that as AR progresses, we're going to get to a point where we have the ability to overlay into the environment that we see 3D objects, interfaces, all the time, on demand, when we want. So we're going to be seeing our own custom reality as we move around. And what that suddenly means is you no longer have to have a physical interface for really anything that would normally have one. So your devices suddenly can become incredibly small. So instead of, for example, having to have a control unit for my air conditioning that is a block on the wall that I have to go and press buttons on, well, it no longer has to be that. It just has to be a thing hidden somewhere that can transmit to my AR device, and then I can pull up a list of devices that I know are around somewhere that I want to control, and I'm controlling them. So this is an idea that it's a prediction to some extent. I expect that we will start to see more of this sort of thing over the next 10 to 20 years, and I've at various points in time decided, I want to work on this, and then I never do. So now I'm just laying out a prediction to see if it happens. So if it happens, then yeah. If it doesn't happen, tell me off.
Miles.
I would say at least since King Ajatasattu, the ancient Indian king's robots, all the way up to the Root of Grace, which is a robotic puppet from the medieval period, moving at the church propelled by the monks at Boxley Abbey, all the way up through the Enlightenment into computing machines, and now into machine learning systems. We have seen machines move, and they have carried different arguments. That's not going to go away. It's just going to keep getting more ubiquitous, and it starts to take on its own character. So where King Ajatasattu's robots designated a really clever solve for the problem of attachment for the ancient Indian, whereas for the ancient Roman commissioned to make it, it was just spring-propelled machinery. So today, increasingly, it's easy to make interfaces that move on their own and process their own calculations. We should start to grow a media literacy in order to know when other people are constructing arguments that are placating around to science and mathematics.
Thank you. Kat?
Okay. I feel very fortunate to have been raised in a home with an engineer and a psychologist. And that's the psychologist right there. Because the importance of complementary expertise. And I think that would be my one kind of thing to leave folks with as we seek out recognizing our own expertise and recognizing the complementary expertise around us. And I think about these interfaces that we are most familiar with, and the questions we ask ourselves are often based on the assumptions that led us here. Most of our products were designed by people who had a high degree of vision. If the world were designed, if our technology had been designed by people who were blind, it would be a very different type of interaction model. And so as we think about how to design voice-based experiences, or how do we design cognitive models that work in this environment and navigation of that environment, seeking out someone who's been talking to or listening to their computer for 20 years because they're blind or because they have limited use of their hands is a type of expertise that can make us better engineers, better technologists. So my invitation is to seek out beyond our own expertise and find partnership with each other.
I've spent most of this panel pitting man against machine, woman against machine. And I began with a Stephen Hawking quote, so I'll end with a Stephen Hawking story. If some of you remember when Stephen Hawking was being interviewed by John Oliver, and Stephen Hawking said to John Oliver, "You're an idiot." And John Oliver said, "Is that you talking or the computer?" And the computer said, "Both of us." I do believe there is a future if we can retain that both of us and combine the best of humanity with the best of technology. Thank you all for attending. Thanks for our sponsors. Thanks for our panel.